Welcome back to the Company Challenge, where I feel like the current batch of runs from the Cold War has run its course, and it's time to try and distill what we can learn from them. What you're watching in the background here is a playthrough of the Troop and Platoon Tactics scenario, where I've replaced the British combat team with some Canadians. So not quite the Company Challenge, but seeing as though the Canadians didn't get their run, I thought they should get at least a little bit of attention. A lot of what I talked about rounding up the first batch of Company Challenges still applies here, but we have got a couple more things to deal with. First and foremost, we introduced some new capabilities into the mix: ATGMs, armour and artillery. These were all somewhat binary capabilities. If an attacking company had ATGMs, like the US and the Soviets, then they destroyed the armoured counterattack in the final phase. If they didn't have ATGMs, like the Brits, then they had a harder time. In a similar vein, having tanks on hand to apply high explosive made clearing the objectives significantly easier than when tanks were unavailable, and obviously the Soviet FSE experience with the doctrinally available artillery basically just deleted half the farm. So having ATGMs, tanks and artillery available is obviously very desirable. We probably didn't need to conduct any tests to work that out. And they're all available to everyone, just in different ways. For this test, I've very consciously restricted the forces to using the organic tables of organisation and equipment as modelled in Combat Mission, but as we noted in the first roundup, TOEs can also represent a smorgasbord of options for commanders to choose from. Our British Armoured Infantry Company, for instance, would be very unlikely to ever attack on its own. The battalion commander would have a list of tasks for his units, and he'd create combat teams tailored to each task by assigning assets from all over the place. So with the Brits, we could easily replicate the US mixed TOE by replacing an infantry platoon with a tank platoon and integrating some ATGM vehicles and mortar carriers. The problem is that replicating that process in-game would essentially boil down to me picking the same force every time, and at that point we're pretty much comparing individual vehicles and pieces of equipment that are fundamentally very similar in capability within the confines of this test. TOW, Milan and AT4 will make mincemeat of the armoured counterattack, just like M60, T62 and Chieftain will neutralise enemy positions with high explosives. So we have a lot of symmetry here. This has to do with the Cold War context. When we were dealing with the World War II companies, we were dealing with wartime TOEs. The different nations started the war with different concepts of how their infantry should be organised and equipped, mostly working off lessons learned from World War I. But not everyone had the same experiences in that war. The Eastern Front was a very different beast to the Western Front, force densities were lower, manoeuvre was more applicable. From the Soviet or Russian perspective, fighting continued well past 1918 anyway, with a very different flavour. Thrown into that mix, we have a slew of theoretical and technological innovations in the interwar period. Once the war started and all these systems came under stress, some of these concepts persisted, some of them were refined, others were by necessity altered as belligerents sought advantage or reacted to manpower and production issues. So we get a lot of variety in the TOEs. But by the end, everybody had incredible amounts of very similar experience. Going into the Cold War, everyone was really reading from the same hymn sheet. The Americans, British, Canadians and Soviets might have drawn slightly different conclusions from the Second World War, but they all certainly agreed that a hot war across the inter-German border would be highly mechanised, pushing the emphasis away from infantry and towards tanks and anti-tank weapons. This helps to explain the surprising symmetry down at company level. In areas where there is some divergence, for instance in squad level armament and organisation, we kind of have to ask how relevant all the differences are. Sure, we can take American, Soviet and British rifle squads or sections and slot them into an infantry food chain. The Americans are clearly at the top with their big squads, assault rifles and integrated GPMGs and ATGMs. Where the Brits, Canadians and Soviets come after that, I think is maybe a bit more up in the air due to the way that Combat Mission handles battle rifles, which is a whole nother thing, but to some extent they're just footnotes. The differences don't matter that much because infantry squads are intended to be used as components in a much larger combat arms team. Everyone has infantry because infantry are key components of the combined arms team, but arguably infantry's role in modern warfare is to either facilitate the actions of or mop up after artillery and armour, in that order. In other words, I feel like the differences between the different infantry organisations, and there were some significant differences, are lost in the difference between combined arms and non-combined arms runs. This is a very long-winded roundabout way of saying that comparing companies in the context of the Cold War is maybe not as interesting as it seemed, at least from an infantry perspective. And of course the test might be at fault here. Injecting some degree of randomness certainly had the potential to make things easier or difficult, depending on the exact buildings inhabited by the enemy and the time their armoured support arrived, but I don't think it really enforced any changes of plan on my part. I attacked from the right every time, mostly dealt with the farm complex in the same order, and generally did the same thing over and over and over again. That is, first of all, pretty damn boring, and given what we just talked about the effective symmetry between all the different factions, pretty rote. And it inevitably had an effect on the way I was tackling it. The ground was the same, so I attacked in the same way, just like the capabilities were the same, so I attacked in the same way. So in a sense, I suppose we shouldn't be too surprised that I'm finding it a little bit difficult to really draw out really meaningful differences between the different companies we tested. Or at least meaningful differences that can't be compensated for by building a task-organised team. That is at least how I feel about it, being the one in the driving seat. You guys might have some different opinions, being on the outside looking in. Moving forwards with the company challenge, I think the whole format might need a real shake-up. I think what we're really missing is randomization of terrain. The map itself has been a key constant in the first two batches of the company challenge. I think it's at least worth exploring some kind of format where the enemy is out there somewhere, and I have to find them. That's something that might be easier at platoon scale, because then the enemy would only be a single squad. One of the problems in randomizing enemy positions is lumping them all together into some kind of coherent defense, which is something that we saw here a little bit. Just one enemy squad is easier to randomize. I could set up an AI plan where there are a dozen or more good enemy positions, find a way to randomize the testing start location, and then play it a few times to get a decent spread. I think that might be more interesting and potentially more instructive than the kind of repetitive company mashing that we've been doing thus far. I think stepping down a bit might also help me out. One thing I think has definitely shone through when I've been attacking the farm complex in these runs is that I have really screwed up some basic infantry attacks. If we add in the somewhat disgusting experience of trying to ferret out Soviet infantry in the troop and platoon tactics scenario, I'm feeling a bit like I need to get back to grips with basic infantry drills. Either way, I think the Cold War is probably not the best place to compare infantry because it's all about high-intensity mechanized warfare. A Cold War gone hot probably wouldn't really have the kind of lower-intensity periods that would showcase lower-intensity infantry on infantry operations. Mostly because everything's going to go nuclear before anybody gets to that stage. Overall, though, that's probably going to have to wait a bit. We're getting to the end of the year. That means it's high time I sorted out the winter turn by turn. I've had several grandiose plans for that slip by because I've been so busy, so I think we're just going to pick a chunky scenario and play through that. We're going to do the Pixel Tripper Adoption Initiative again, though, so keep an eye out for that if you want to participate. Anyway, that's the broad direction of travel here. I suspect this would maybe have been a bit more of an interesting roundup if I'd done it sooner and I could remember more about what we'd done. There is probably stuff that I've forgotten or skimmed here, so let me know in the comments and I'll see if I can answer it there. Regardless, hope you found this interesting. I'm looking forward to where we go next with this. If you'd like to see these videos early and support the channel, you can do so via Patreon and YouTube memberships. Whether you do or not, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.